All right, so I wanted to follow up with your presuppositional video. I like the style, and I wanted to present, I guess you could say, the exact opposite. I don't want to presuppose it. I would rather draw it as a conclusion as an inference. So if I'm approaching it from a theist perspective, the proposition that God exists in the most basic way, how would you approach that line of questioning differently from the presuppositional?
How would I do it differently from what I did in that video?
Yeah, so from his
hmm
perspective, he used the presuppositional approach. So
hmm
if you're going to go on a similar line of questioning from someone that's not, but still defends a theistic proposition as an inference, how would you approach that
Oh,
differently?
okay. Okay. So how would I approach a line of questioning with somebody who's not a precept, who's
Right.
making a conclusion?
Yeah, it would be an
Okay.
inference rather than a precept. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I would start with what's like, let's do run me through your logic, run me through your argument. Yeah, and just start there.
Okay, I believe. I don't know if I have anything necessarily against presupposition. I mean, I don't find it persuasive. I believe that theism can be a rational conclusion that you can infer from any particular amount of evidence or arguments that you find persuasive. I don't think it's compelling, but I think it can be rational to believe from any set of arguments for natural theology. That's, I guess, the simple version. As far as which arguments, I mean, there's varying amounts that are independent of one another, but I think God can be a rational inference from the evidence.
Okay. I mean, I guess my position is I so on my way out of Christianity, I adopted deism for a while because I was convinced by arguments like, well, I mean, just look at the universe we live in, look at the apparent design we see in the universe. It seems like everything is so rigged, and for me that did seem like a rational conclusion for a while. But after thinking about it, I came to the conclusion that I don't know that that's the case. Like to me, it sounds like an argument, like a sort of God of the gaps argument.
Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
I could think of people like way back in the day, like in prehistoric times, whatever, attributing things to God that they just didn't understand, and that would have been like a sort of rational conclusion in their minds, like, well, who else could have caused lightning? Who else could have created the seasons? You know, it has a certain intuitive rationality to it, but it's sort of a jumping to conclusions.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, lightning was one of the first examples I thought of, like lightning or the sun and the moon, things like that, natural phenomenon. So I think God of the Gaps is a real thing that people use, and I agree. It's a fairly primitive form of inference. When I'm thinking of an inference or like the conclusion of whatever kind of deductive reasoning you might be using, I don't think God of the Gaps is rational because it's just trying to plug scientific knowledge, like holes in our knowledge with God. So you're not really concluding that God exists from the evidence. Rather, you're inferring it from the lack of evidence. Like almost a better way of explaining God of the Gaps. So I agree with that. Something that might go toward how our inferences could differ, what not necessarily just like you and me, but the two different positions is the background axioms we're adopting, like what assumptions, like metaphysical or scientific, we're bringing to the table that will shape how our inferences will go. So that could be a good place to dig in because there's probably some difference in there. I think there's also some common ground. So finding the common ground will help us get toward common conclusions. I would say that's a good starting point.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, sort of the background knowledge that I come to the table with are really just the most basic like assumptions without which we couldn't know anything. Like those are the kind of things that I assume, like the same kind of things that everybody from every tradition, from every belief system adopts, things like the validity of logic and stuff like
Right.
that. Like those are kind of like the only basic assumptions I bring to the table.
Exactly. And I think we actually probably have more of those in common the more that we differ. And so finding the like getting those common ones established, like figuring out what those are and figuring out what's left. And there's probably some gray areas where neither of us necessarily hold a specific one, um, like super strongly or with certainty. Like we could be very tentative on a couple, because I know I am. The ones I'm thinking of aren't really theism related, like they won't be relevant to that. The one off my head is time theory with respect to general relativity. Like I'm pretty tentative on that kind of assumption on how time would work in that respect. I don't see how that's going to be directly related to theism, although I think it's related to some of the arguments theists give, but I don't really hold a lot of water in that area. But I think, yeah, getting those assumptions out of the way and figuring out where there's differences. And I think this is where my, I guess you could say, difference from other theists are. When I say I don't find it compelling, as in I don't think like you'll be compelled to believe it from the evidence. I just think it's like it'll be rational to hold, like it, because if it was compelling, like pretty much everyone would believe it. So I think that's pretty obvious. It won't compel belief. Um, so whether or not someone can make the inference to it will be more about like their sincerity after truth rather than just trying to avoid the conclusion. And I think people will often, at least in my experience, that don't want it to be true will avoid certain assumptions just from incredulity. Like they will avoid a certain metaphysical principle or science, something like that, because they see where it's leading. So if that's the case, I don't think it's possible to persuade that kind of mindset. I don't approach it that way, so I think finding those common grounds between us would be good because I don't think you do either.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there are any basic assumptions that we would disagree on?
Well,
Because
I
the
think
ones I hold are
there,
the
there,
ones
there
that I have.
almost there almost has to be, or we'd be reaching the same. Like our principles of reasoning have to differ at. They would have to break down at some point, whether even if it's just one. Otherwise, we'd probably reach all the same conclusions, unless there's just some data that one of us isn't aware of, which is unlikely. So there's some principle somewhere, some axiom that we differ on. I do think, though, that I said I think the vast majority we share. So we'll probably go. I'm going to start. Probably I'm going to ask you a few, and if you think of, you can ask me a few. These are the ones I think we probably share, and then as we that'll let us think of more to get to the ones that we don't.
Cool.
So I think the first one that you brought up is logic. I think we share that. I think we both share the assumption that the laws of logic are valid and that they are relatively self-justifying, that they don't require some further fundamental axiom to believe. Would you say, at least on a basic level, that that's true?
I don't know about the self-justifying part. I mean, I don't. This is maybe kind of a tangent. I don't know that we can justify logic. I mean, to say it's self-justifying,
That could
I,
almost be another way of saying that, yeah. Like you don't necessarily. So we would both agree that it's valid, like that it's a necessary assumption to use to make inferences from data.
yeah, it seems
Yeah.
like we can't really do knowledge without assuming the validity of logic.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
that, so it's something we accept as true because
Yeah.
because it's a necessary foundation.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and I'm okay with either it not being justifiable, like there's no further way to do it, or self-justifying being kind of a synonym for that. Like I'm okay with any of those. I don't really,
Okay.
I don't find that super. I don't want to say it's relevant, but I don't find it super backbreaking because, like you said, you can't reason without it. And that kind of ties in. I won't get into the specifics, but Aristotle's like nine rules of inference. That kind of ties in. So we'll just bucket all that together. Okay, so we share that. I would assume that you are a scientific realist, that you believe the world is real and objective. It's not just a model that's useful, right? Like you're not an anti-realist, at least on a
Yeah.
superficial level, I would say. So we
Yeah.
probably
I
both share
mean,
that.
yeah. I mean, I'm not really familiar with some of these philosophical terms, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I think the world around me
It's real, yeah.
seems real. I mean, I suppose you can imagine a scenario like the Matrix where it's not real.
Yeah. So that's a good point. And I'm not like a high level philosopher. I hear that that's the way some people apparently anti-realism is a thing where like models like where the like it's not that the galaxies are really out there. It's just a useful model that gives us accurate predictions. Like apparently that's I've never met someone that believes this, but I mean I guess you could. So we both believe the world's objectively real. We're realists. I would assume that you agree that our senses are generally reliable. Not like
Hmm.
infallible, clearly, but generally reliable. So these I'm going over, I think, are referred to as properly basic beliefs, which are beliefs that can't necessarily be proven, but you're rational to believe unless there's some reason to doubt them. Some defeater, I think they're called defeaters, an objection. So that would include our senses, knowledge of the external world. That would involve certain metaphysical truths like the laws of logic, or that other minds exist, that you're not just a solo mind hallucinating everything, that the past was real, like you can't prove these things. So I think you and I would share all the properly basic beliefs. Um, okay, so are you thinking of any principles we might not share, or assumptions?
I really, yeah, I'm wondering what those would be.
Okay, so
What?
here's one that might be. I'm not 100%. Are you familiar with Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason? It's also sometimes called like the causal principle, or has a couple different names, but it's usually referred to as principle of sufficient reason. Okay,
Okay.
so
No, I'm not familiar with that.
all right, so the simple way of putting it is that any true proposition, any real existing thing has a reason that would be sufficient to make it real. It's a sort of quasi causal principle, I guess you could say, that if something exists or is true, or in any concrete sense, that there's a reason that makes it sufficient to be that case. It's almost like a truism to say that. So, like, if it wasn't sufficient to produce its reality or to make it true, it just wouldn't be. It would either be false or it wouldn't be real. Um, it corresponds, I think, with the that Latin phrase "ex nihilo nihil fit," out of nothing, nothing comes. So it's like a version of that. There's like strong and weak versions, but would you say that at least on a superficial level, like without getting too technical, that you would adopt a sort of principle sufficient reason or causal principle? That there's
Yeah,
reasons
that
that things
makes.
exist. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. Again, I'm not familiar with the debate and philosophy. But yeah, I mean, this that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the common sense view anyway. Now there are
Hmm.
people who will deny it on some levels, but that goes back to what I said earlier. I think a lot of them do so only in a theistic context, like being more incredulous than being kind of sincerely denying it. Because you can't even really do science without assuming that there are explanations.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's like sort of an explanatory principle that there, like, if something is real, there's an explanation for it. Now that doesn't mean we know what it is. It just says, like, it's not that something just inexplicably exists.
Hmm.
Okay, so I think we share that one. So that was one we potentially didn't, at least, and it might get revealed that maybe there's some versions of that that don't. Okay, what about let's see, axioms. What about like your thoughts on how time works? I don't know if this is necessarily an assumption. It could also be a conclusion. But do you have any particular beliefs on how time works that might differ from a? No. Okay.
I
So
really don't know.
okay, that's good. And then from there, I think it just comes down to basic epistemology, like our standards of knowledge and evidence. I think we probably share more than we don't, but we there might be some differences there. Would you say you hold to a principle of scientific evidence? I think it used to be called like logical positivism. That is like you can't believe anything rationally unless it can be scientifically proven. Would you say you hold that?
I don't know. So I hesitate to make absolute statements. I mean,
Okay, that's good.
I yeah. I mean, I suppose scientific evidence, serves to prove a great deal of knowledge claims. Could there possibly be claims that require some other type of evidence? Yeah, sure, maybe. I mean,
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, that's actually a good way of looking at it, like not wanting to say that absolutely, because obviously I think science is undeniable in its explanatory power. But I think it was like the first half of the 20th century, it was rampant in philosophy of science that, like, if it can't be scientifically proven, it was a meaningless proposition. Now that later collapsed for two reasons. One, it was overly restrictive in its application. Even science couldn't justify some of its own assumptions under this criteria. Like, I think in special relativity, um, the speed of lights, we can only measure its round trip velocity. We can't measure its one way, so we would just assume that it traveled at a constant speed one way. And we would have to make that assumption to hold to special relativity, but we couldn't prove it through empirical data. And so science wouldn't even hold up to its own scrutiny. And also, it's a self defeating proposition. Like, you can't scientifically prove the proposition. You should only believe what you can scientifically prove. You'd just be arguing in a circle. So,
Hmm.
apparently, from what the literature says, it collapsed, but I think some people still promulgate it a little bit, like Lawrence Krauss and people. But either way, I agree with you. I wouldn't make a sweeping statement like that an absolute, so to say. But the reason I brought that up is because I think the sort of God debate comes down a lot of the time to the standard of evidence, and we think of evidence in that sort of scientific empirical sense. And if God is like supposed to be some kind of transcendent being, like you're just not going to have that.
You
So
see, I think the moment you define God as transcendent, you, you're kind of you're kind of stuck with the idea that you can't act like if he exists. Let's assume he exists, but he's transcendent. Then how do you have access to him? Like how
okay,
does your mind apprehend his existence if it's he transcends existence?
I think
And
that's
let
actually a good point. That's a really like we should get to like what we're defining as obviously we need to be on the same page as that. I think when we say the word God on a general level, most people get an idea of what we mean. I don't think most people literally think in a classical theistic sense that we mean like a bearded guy up in the clouds. Like in a not that's not literally that's like a an anthropomorphism of what where God's supposed to be. I think generally people understand the idea of like a sort of creator, designer, all powerful being. Like generally, although I think the minutia is different sometimes, and it can matter. So like when you say transcendent, what does that mean? How do you have access? That's a good objection because that gets down to the details of how we'll measure one our standard of evidence to rationally believe that that's real or lack thereof, and two how we can have knowledge of what that is. So I think that's a good point. And this is where I'll distinguish between natural theology and revealed theology. So a lot of religions will appeal to their scripture or their holy texts to say this is how we know, right? Now, I would agree with you if you make the objection that that's circular. I agree with that. Like you can't assume that that's true to prove that it's true. Like it just doesn't work. So I'm not going to be referring to any special revelation to try to prove or try to say that's how I have data. And I think that might be a problem with the presupposition. Honestly, I think that's one of the
Yeah,
internal
yeah.
inconsistencies.
I mean, their position is admittedly circular,
Yeah,
and they try to dismiss it by saying, well, all arguments for ultimate authority are circular. And like I hear that, and I'm like, so basically, you're saying because they do circular, um, their logic is circular. It's okay if mine is circular. It doesn't make sense. Like
yeah,
two wrongs don't make a right.
exactly. Yeah,
It's like the more logical conclusion is, well, okay, then concerning ultimate authorities, I just would take an agnostic position of I don't know.
yeah. And I since I agree with that, I don't do it myself. Now the so we're not I'm not gonna, no special revelation, right? No assumptions there. I think to rationally believe it, you need to infer it from data, like just like I would anything that's not a properly basic belief. Now, I think God as a being, like if God's real, I think God Himself or itself, I don't know if gender matters, could also be a properly basic belief. That's a little different conversation that we might get into at the end. But so there's another type of theology that's I think a little less popular on a popular level, but it's growing a little bit with the internet called natural theology, which is almost the exact opposite. It's inferring God from data from the natural world. And not just natural world in a scientific sense, although that's a big part of it. It can also be from just basic logical principles, assumptions, things like axioms you have that are independent of theism. So that will be, I guess you could say, the approach I'm using to try to make it rational to believe. But again, not compelling. Like that's really important because that the audience understands that because I don't think it is like you'll observe the data and then you just have to believe it because it's so persuasive. I don't think that's the case. Um, I just think it'd be the case that if you're like actually sincerely observing the data, that you can see it's rational to believe. We're contrasting that to something that's irrational to believe, like I would say, like the flat Earth. I think that's irrational to believe in face of the data.
Hmm.
But I think theism can be rational to believe, but not necessarily compelling in the same way that the moon exists. Like you just see it, and your sense data compels the belief.
Hmm.
So
I'm wondering, what if we had more than one rational belief? Like if we had God as a rational belief, and then we had competing belief
yes,
systems
so
that could be similarly, not compelling but rational. We have these different rational. Like, how do we go about deciding which one?
I think that's almost like the textbook definition of what an agnostic is, because so if you have theism defends the proposition God exists, Atheism defends the proposition God does not exist. So those are two different contradictory propositions that can have their own sets of evidence and arguments, right? So the agnostic says the arguments for both are equally rational, so they take neither position. And so I think that is also a rational position to take, like from observing the evidence. You can be like, I find these arguments, like some of these arguments, persuasive, and some of these not. On this side, some of these are and are not on this side, and they make no claim, right? So that's exactly what agnosticism is. Now, I don't personally believe that's tenable long term. Like the scales never tip ever. Like I don't think unless you're just apathetic, I don't think that's a sustainable belief long term. And I think most agnostics are born out of apathy. I wouldn't say all of them though. I think there are some sincere, rational agnostics, and that also could be, and I mean this in a purely scholastic way, could be out of a sense of ignorance too. Like they might not be aware of all the arguments on both of the sides. Maybe it would be if they're presented with one of the arguments, they would persuade to the other side. Um, so
For me, like I guess I would kind of define myself as somewhat of an agnostic, and for me, it really is. It comes down to that like the sort
yeah,
of rational justification you just gave, where it's like you have these two claims, and they're both equally unprovable. So it's like I'm
yeah.
just like I don't know.
So in like in a perfect idealized rational brain, you would have all of the arguments on both sides, and you'd say, okay, this argument is good and sound. This one's not. This one's good and sound. Like, and then whichever one has an outweighing factor, if there was, you would tip to that scale. And I'm not saying to like a hard degree of certainty, right? Like I'm not saying I'm certain God. I think it's rational that to believe God does exist, and I do believe that proposition, but I'm not certain, right? So it's not like that's the only option, and like that would be certainty, right? It's just that I find the scales slightly tipped in theism. So the agnostic finds the scales perfectly balanced. Um, and I think that is a rational position to take. Like with the data you have, with the assumptions you have, your axioms, the logic, you're not saying God doesn't exist, but you don't find it persuasive that God exists. So the scales are balanced. Um, I was an agnostic for a while. Well, I guess a better way of putting it is for me, the scales have been tipping back and forth over the years. So right now they're tipped in favor of theism. I'm open to a persuasive atheist argument, like absolutely open to it. I've studied as much as I could, and I'm familiar with a lot of literature, but I'm by no means going to assume I've heard every possible argument. So if I was given a really good argument for atheism that I couldn't object to very cleanly, it would depend on the weight. If it would tip the entire scale over, if it would go back to balance, then I'd be back to agnostic.
Yeah, I appreciate that openness. And like I think one thing that makes it hard for believers to have that kind of openness is the threat of hell. You
Yes.
know, like I remember as a Christian, when my doctrine of hell became less like traditional, I felt free to really explore the issue, confident that even if God does exist, he's not going to hold it against me that I got my logic wrong.
Yeah.
You know, I got my mathematics wrong when it came to this argument. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I mean, getting specifically into like religion, like Christianity, like that opens a whole other Pandora's box. So like those factors matter for sure, and I think a degrees of indoctrination make a difference too. Like if you grew up with it, and your like values and assumptions you're instilled with can definitely affect how you reason. And I mean, my situation was also similar. Like I grew up with a pretty strong fear of hell as a kid, so I think that probably to some degree influenced how I saw things. But just speaking purely on theism, like so not taking specific religious doctrines into consideration, the question would be, okay, what arguments do you find making it equally balanced? Is it a combination of equally persuasive arguments, equally unpersuasive arguments, or a mixture of both?
yeah, I mean, for me, like the major argument for a theistic kind of God, like bare bones theism, you know, think theism, is that there has to be something that's a cause to the universe. There has to be some kind of first cause, and it seems to be that this first cause, whatever it is, you know, set things up and the way they are. Like that's the strongest argument. Basically, it's saying that it's necessary, that God is necessary, given what we observe about the universe. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think he's necessary. I think he could be one explanation, but I can easily, like, if I just think about it, I can think of other. scenarios or possibilities or explanations that would equally explain things.
Okay, so that would you say that's an example of what you're agnostic about? You're like, okay, I could see that being true, but I could also see this, and so I don't find the scale tipping on that case, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
It's like you can imagine looking at something and trying to figure out what caused it. If you think long and hard enough, you can come up with several potential causes for that thing, but all of them could be equally unverifiable. And in the case of a transcendent being, I think they are.
okay, that's actually a very good point. So we'll start with that one. That's one of the, I think, one of the primary arguments for theism people use, like the sort of cosmological, like first cause arguments. So we'll start with that one. And it takes a few forms, but the one you explained, I think, is the best and the simplest. And simplicity is good at getting at truth because when you overly complex things, I don't know. I think it's almost like try hard. So um, so that first one. So that one you explained the sort of necessitate first cause thing. That's the theist version. And you said you can think of several equally plausible, and I honestly I can too, explanations. Um, and I'm guessing these are in the domain of science. Or are you thinking of other non-scientific, non-theistic explanations?
Both. I mean, I can think of alternative theistic explanations and alternative non-theistic explanations.
Okay, now would you say, and I don't know if this is easy to answer because I'm trying to think of what I would answer, and this might be hard to answer. Would you say, in terms of these explanations that you've like thought about and considered and read about, the amount of data you have on this particular argument, would you say like they're in terms of their explanatory scope and power that they're all exactly equal, or do you think the scale maybe tips in slight favor of one of the other ones, like the science?
Yeah, yeah, I would say they're exactly
Do
equal
you think
in terms.
that's out of ignorance on our part, like we don't have enough data about the early universe and stuff like that, or like what do you
Yeah,
think?
exactly. It's totally that. It's something that we just don't know about.
Okay,
And yeah,
okay, that's good. That's good. So I think from here it can kind of go into two directions, and I think both directions are relevant. So I'll let you, before I ask another question, I'll let you pick. There's the sort of science direction, like what the current mainstream science says today, and then there's the more philosophical direction when it comes to like causality and logic and stuff. Like, which one of those, at least to start with, do you think you would be more likely to find persuasive?
so a science explanation and a philosophical explanation.
Yeah, considering the scientific data, right? So like you can kind of argue for metaphysical propositions using scientific data, and then you can do it without that, right? So you can supplement them too, but I mean I'm trying to like organize it for simplicity. Say like
Hmm.
I recognize these are two different paths. One is using science, one is not. Which one of those do you think you're more likely to find persuasive?
I would probably find this a scientific argument the most persuasive.
Okay,
I
so
think because philosophy is just, yeah, I don't know how to explain it, but it's just,
it's definitely
it's,
more abstract. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I want to clarify. I am not claiming I have scientific evidence of God. In case anyone in the comments thinks I am, I'm not saying that. I don't think that is on the same rational scale. Like if God is supposed to be this transcendent being or whatever, it's not in the universe. You don't have data in the universe about something that's not in the universe. So I agree. Like there's no scientific evidence for God. So what I meant by science is like there can be scientific evidence for theistically neutral premises in an argument, like a syllogism that might have a theistic conclusion. So what might that be? So this kind of gets more into cosmological data, and this is pretty common in the literature. But this will come down to, I think, I'm assuming you accept all of whatever mainstream science says today. Like I don't have any quarrel with mainstream science, but I'm assuming you do. So are you familiar? Like I'm sure you've heard of Big Bang Theory and all that stuff, right?
hmm.
So currently, I think the current estimated age of the universe is 13 point like 8 or 7 billion years.
Hmm.
So the fact that it has an age is a relatively new discovery. For the majority of, I guess you could say, more primitive scientific, like back in the 19th century and before, all the scientists and astronomers believed the universe was eternal. They also believed the universe was just the Milky Way, but they thought it was just always there, this sort of static entity, and that it wasn't really dynamic and aging. It wasn't until obviously Einstein and Hubble and all that stuff that we got the Big Bang Theory and an age, like a beginning. So that caused a lot of kerfuffle. In fact, the phrase I think Big Bang came from a Catholic priest, and I guess they didn't like that because they didn't want like what he thought it implied. But
So can I pause you there for a
yeah,
minute? So I find a lot of times when Christians or theists you talk about the Big Bang, they talk about it how it proves that the universe had a beginning. And based on my understanding of the Big Bang, and I am no physicist or
yeah,
cosmologist
me
or
either. Yeah,
whatever, it doesn't claim that the universe had a beginning. It claims that the universe, as it currently exists, has a beginning. In other words, we once didn't have stars, we didn't have matter, we didn't have time, but that it existed in a super compressed point. I don't know what they call it exactly. Um,
yeah. Oh, the singularity. Yeah, I know what you're
this,
talking
yeah,
about.
right. It began as that, and that singularity had to be like at one point exploded, giving rise to the universe. And so we don't know what existed prior to that explosion. Like, is the singularity eternal? Was it was it compressed from a previously expanded universe? I mean, and other possibilities we just don't know.
Yes. Okay. So that's a good point. And I think that's actually the crux of the entire thing when theists point to the Big Bang as their sort of scientific premise for a beginning. So there are a lot of models, and yeah, you just kind of gave us examples of a few of them. I think like an oscillating model where like expand, contract, expand. That went on forever. Loop quantum gravity. Like there's still some that are in the literature today. And then there's what's called just the standard Big Bang model, which is definitely incomplete. Down to what they call the Planck scale, where you compress everything to that singularity. The Planck scale, or whatever that length and amount of time is, like 10 to the negative whatever seconds after the Big Bang. Current physics breaks down, so they can't push it past that. And that's why I think they're trying to find that theory of everything, which unifies general relativity, which breaks down there, and then quantum mechanics. Then they'll know. So yeah, you're definitely right that it's incomplete. But the standard model predicts an absolute beginning, like t equals zero is what they call it. That like time had a first moment, but we can't describe the physical regime prior to the Planck time. And I can't remember. I don't think it was Roger Penrose. I can't remember the physicist's name, but he said it's as if a tiny window shade has been drawn over the first split second of the universe, and we can't see through the window shade, so we don't know what happens. He said, but we do know it doesn't come out on the other side. Now that's just one physicist's opinion. A lot of them believe we can restore the eternal universe. There have been a lot of models offered that try to predict before the initial singularity there were physical states that were real and stuff like that. Over the 20th century, at least from what I've been reading, most of these models have been a short way of explaining one failed attempt after another to try to revert the eternal universe again. Either they've been shown to be mathematically consistent, or they ended up implying the very beginning they've sought to avoid. And this gets into some very detailed scientific stuff like the Borguth-Vilenkin theorem and all that. They predict apparently any universe that is in a state of cosmic expansion can't be past eternal, that there ends up being a space-time boundary in the past. Now the current standard model predicts it at 13.7 billion years, but there is a chance, and there's a lot of people think there's a good chance that more discoveries in the unification of quantum theory and relativity will restore the eternal universe. But this gets to an interesting point: is all you can really have on cosmologic models is models consistent with an eternal universe. You can't like verify an eternal past, right? You can only falsify it. You can't falsify a beginning, you can only verify it, right?
So another thing to keep in mind too is that you don't need an eternal universe. You can have a multiverse that gave rise to a finite universe. The
Yeah,
universe
like a
at
sort
one
of
point,
embedded one. Yeah.
yeah, the universe at one point didn't exist, and there's this multiverse that gave rise to it, and boom, it came into existence.
No, I
You know,
agree. In fact, that's actually one of the other proposals is the multiverse, like the sort of larger embedding universes that, and I think black hole theories are one where black hole singularities spawn baby universes. So yeah, definitely a lot of explanations, and I think the appeal to those, like if you were going to argue against theism, is that even though a multiverse is a metaphysical hypothesis that you can't verify, it at least involves known physics and known realities, other universes, for examples, or black holes.
mhm.
Whereas God is this more kind of exotic, unknown hypothesis. So I get that appeal. In fact, I feel it myself. I think a multiverse hypothesis is very plausible, although it depends on the details. I think the details matter on like what exactly they're proposing. But in terms of the current, the most current physics, which is definitely provisional, does predict an absolute beginning of time and space. Like that's what the Big Bang model current predicts. It's supplemented with additional hypotheses that there might be other universes, but there's no empirical data. So if we're going to say that, that wouldn't be a further scientific explanation. It would actually be a metaphysical one along with God. So then the argument would be, well, it's a more plausible metaphysical argument because it involves already known things like universes, space time, and physics, as opposed to this exotic thing. So if I think I'm going to concede that point. I won't try to argue that that's a more persuasive just given that set of data. But if if a theist wants to argue from the beginning of the universe, he can at least say he's within the current, like today's mainstream science to say the universe began to exist and even has an age. Like I think that part he can say he's rational to do. So from there, like obviously the universe began to exist doesn't get you to God, right? It doesn't just immediately get you to
Yeah.
God. So you have
Yeah,
to.
I don't think it gets you to God any more than it gets you to the multiverse. I think both of those, like the multiverse is a good example of a prior cause that's not that, that's not God. And then we can equally just kind of imagine
Okay,
being the
so
case.
that's a good example of where when I said the details matter. So I think that depends on what exactly this beginning implies. So if it's a beginning of this observed space time, then I think you're right. Like that's just kind of left in a scientific haze that like there could have been a prior state or whatever. If it's more about what the original standard Big Bang model and Borguth's boundary proposed, that it's an absolute beginning to time and space itself, if that's your starting point, I think that's where theists try to infer God from. Because if they start with that causal principle that we mentioned at the beginning, that like a sufficient reason, like okay, something would produce space time, you would then sort of deduce properties of what would have to exist to create space and time. And if it's not space and like space and time didn't create space and time, so what would that be? And this is where you kind of flesh out what are generally considered theistic properties, like
Yeah.
like spaceless, timeless, immaterial, like that kind of stuff. Now
You
you don't.
see,
That's what they call
these
God, but
right, these properties, like when I hear them, I'm like, if you're going to attribute those properties to some prior cause, why does it have to be God? Like, why can't the multiverse be
no.
spaceless, timeless?
Okay, that's actually the $1 million question. So let's first hash out what that. So spaceless, timeless, whatever. It has to have some kind of causal ability to produce effects. Um, you don't actually have to call it God. I think that has some connotations people don't really like. I think in the classical like philosophical theistic sense, that's what they mean when they say God. I don't think it would be appropriate to call it another universe. Because I think what we mean by universe is all contiguous space-time reality. So if whatever caused that is
Yeah, right.
itself the universe. But
I like to say just some some reality outside of this universe.
yes, yes. So an external reality that caused the universe.
Right.
Now this gets into, and this might be a good segue. This gets into another independent argument that I think they kind of flow together, but they are two independent arguments. But we'll finish the science one. So I think you aren't wrong to say like why call that God, especially in the religious context. Like why attribute the God of the world's religions to this sort of explanatory mechanism that we're just inferring these properties from our current science data, which could change. Um, and my answer to that is you don't really have to call it God. I mean, that's I think generally what people refer to as God in a classical theistic sense, but there are a few things lacking. Being personal, like being
Hmm.
conscious, and then having I guess the religious like omniscient, omnipresent, all that stuff, right? So let's take a few steps back. Let's not get into that religious part, but let's just say like, what do you think, just in your impression from reaching? You seem to at least be willing to say it's rational to understand why you would infer that, not necessarily go all the way to say religious God, but what do you think of the idea that this reality is conscious, at least in a sort of high metaphysical sense, not necessarily like an embodied sense? Like there's some degree of consciousness to this static, spaceless reality. Because I think,
Consciousness.
yeah, like it has awareness, however you want
Mm.
to define it in the most basic sense. Because I think on the most fundamental level, that's what God is on a very basic level, right? And like sans all religious revelation, all that stuff, just a conscious, spaceless, timeless reality that began space time.
Yeah.
I think that on a, and I think that that sounds like a new idea, right? Like that sounds very new to the God debate, and I'll agree it sounds new, but on the foundational level, that's actually what theism starts with, right? Then you have to kind of build on it to get to the other stuff. But
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I see consciousness as a necessary property. I mean, some of the other thing attributes that people slap on this prior cause, I don't even think are necessary. Like when people say it has to be immaterial, that's not the case, because material can just give rise to material reality. But like when it comes to consciousness, like I'm just like, why does it have to be? Why is this necessary?
well, I would agree. It doesn't. It just right there on the surface, you it could be or not be conscious, right? The God proposition is saying that this reality is conscious. So then the question is, why think that? You could either be agnostic about it or say like, there's just no reason to think it is. So to get from agnostic to think it's conscious, there's been a handful of arguments I've heard. I only found one like kind of persuasive. The other ones I'm kind of neutral on. I haven't really heard a good argument that it's necessarily impersonal, other than we don't know what that would mean because all of our experience of persons are embodied physical persons. Like that's the only
Yeah.
argument I've heard. And while I think that's a rational position to take, I don't really find it persuasive, especially if we have independent reasons to think that this is out there. So that'll depend, and I'll present that to you, see what you think. Um, so this will also get down to some more fundamental assumptions on like how like space and time works and causality and stuff like that. But I'm going to assume for the sake of this one that time is dynamic. We'll get into that maybe later because I don't think it's necessary to believe it is on a larger scale. But let's assume time's dynamic, temporal, becoming is real, past is no longer real, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So if that's the case, let's assume the Big Bang is what the standard model says it is, absolute beginning of time. So whatever brought that into being is timeless, spaceless, blah blah blah. Let's say that's the case. We don't
Okay.
know if it's conscious. So just inferring, like using deductive reasoning, what would be the most rational thing to take? So here's a question I have for you. Um, if this thing is timeless, right? No time, no change. What what impersonal set of mechanisms would be in place and to be sufficient to produce an effect that is itself temporal and in time? Like, why only now does it just start to exist? Why wouldn't the effect also be timeless with it? If all the sufficient conditions are impersonal and just timeless, why only a finite time ago does its effect begin if it's not conscious? Because I don't want to interrupt you. I want to hear what you have
Yeah.
to say.
I mean, my basic question is, I mean, answer is I don't know, but if I had to like
Your
just kind
inclination,
of,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, is I don't know. That's just to being totally honest about it. But if I had to like brainstorm potential explanations, maybe it's in its nature to give rise to this one universe at this particular, I don't want to say point in time because it probably doesn't
Yeah,
apply, but
right.
it's in its nature to do it.
Okay.
Similar to
Yeah,
how it's in the nature of like sodium and chloride to bind to each other.
like kind of like a law of physics. Okay. So I'm gonna have to I'll hash out a little more what these words mean because I think either we're saying the same thing and not you're just not calling it consciousness, or we're saying different things and we might not be understanding what the terms like timeless and sufficient mean. So if it's timeless, it doesn't change, right? So all of its properties, all of its conditions are omnitemporal. It's completely present at all times. It doesn't change. Because if it did, then that'd be a measurable time, whatever unit you would use, like
Hmm.
we have in our current space time. So, and again, this is all dynamic theory. I know there's going to be people in the comments that are familiar with different time theories on relativity. So we're assuming a theory right now. But anyway, so if this thing is timeless and it has causal potential to bring about the universe that is temporal, that means it had in the principle of sufficient reason it had to have sufficient conditions to bring it about. Like that's just truism. But all those sufficient conditions should be timelessly present, right? Otherwise, it's not timeless. I think this is the inference to the sort of agency of this reality being conscious. Maybe agency might be a better word. I don't know. But I think this is the inference they make, is that if all the conditions are sufficiently present, that the only rational way, unless you can present another one that I haven't heard, to get from a timeless cause to a temporal effect is if the cause is a personal agent that has free will to produce new effects in time without any antecedent conditions. Because otherwise, those conditions are timeless, and its effect should be timeless along with it. I think Immanuel Kant gave an example of a heavy ball resting on a cushion, and it makes a depression in the cushion. So you can conceive this. Now, even though it's physically impossible, you can conceive, for the sake of the argument, that this is timeless, right? Like, imagine this is timeless. It was never created, it was never placed on the cushion, it's just there. You can draw the causal arrow from the ball's shape to the depression in the cushion, not the other way. It's not the depression of the cushion that causes the ball to be round. That's the sort of timeless and temporal effect. So if this timeless existing thing caused the universe that's temporal, and all the conditions have to be sufficient to do so, if it's timeless, then those sufficient conditions are timeless with it. I think that's where people, in the purely rational sense, get from that to saying that this is an agent. And when we say a timeless agent, personal agent that caused the universe, that's what we mean when we say God. I think at that point it's starting to sound more like God than it does some sort of impersonal mechanism. Unless you have an objection, because I'd be happy to hear it. This is the modus cosmological operandi. This is the basic inference from first cause to agency.
Mm.
Now, I think you can make objections to this. Like, we're only able to understand this concept of agency because of ourselves, so we're extrapolating that to a lot. Like, there's objections, but I think that at least provides the start of a rational basis of theism if you start supplementing it with other things. And that's where, when you said necessity, I wanted to get into that, because when you say it's not necessary, I agree. It's not necessary to get to that. That's kind of God of the gaps. They're trying to say it's necessary to have God there. I think you can infer it like we did. But necessity can also be a modal property. It's like a type of logic called modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity. I want to see what you think about this. I'm going to have to do a lot of background because there's a lot of weird jargon. Have you heard of the difference between like contingency and necessity? Does that sound familiar? Have you heard of those words used in that way?
I've heard the words used. Yeah. So
So
necessity is like something that simply is.
yeah, let's take propositions. So let's take the proposition. The Burj Khalifa is the tallest building in the world in 2019. So that's a proposition, right? That's true. That's a true proposition. But it's contingently true, which means it could have been false. It could have been that they made the Empire State Building much taller, and it was the tallest, right? So that's contingent proposition. It's contingent on outside things to make it true. A necessary proposition would be like 2 plus 2 equals 4, or like laws of logic, or truisms like if it is raining, then it is raining. So that's like necessarily true, which means that it's true by the nature of it being necessary rather than some external like cause. And then there's impossible propositions, which are whatever violates laws of logic, like a married bachelor or round square or whatever. So that's called modal logic, right? That's the simple version. I heard an argument from Alexander Proust at Baylor using this to not really get to God, but it kind of gets outside of the natural world. So I want to hear what you think. So he has something called the big conjunctive contingent fact. So think of all contingent propositions, things, right? Planets, stars, people, the president, being in the time, all that stuff, all contingent proposition. Put it in a set, right? He calls the set C for contingency. So every proposition or thing in the set is contingent. Nothing outside the set is contingent because the set is the whole of all contingent reality. So given our principle of sufficient reason, or like our cause principle, would the cause of the set be contingent or not?
And by definition,
I
not.
go, not, right. So its only option would be that it's necessary. It's a necessary reality that caused contingent reality. Now, I think on a common sense level, that just sounds obvious, but I think people will try to get out of it if they think it leads to theism. So that's why I'm trying to give like the reasoning process. So this constructs what's called, or what my brother called, the contingency argument against naturalism. And by naturalism, I mean the natural world's the only thing that exists. Nature, like space-time physics and stuff. So the premise, it goes like this: Premise one: if naturalism is true, then contingent reality is all that exists, nature. Premise two: contingent reality is not all that exists, C, conjunctive fact. Therefore, naturalism is not true. Now that doesn't necessarily mean God exists. I would say it's not necessary, but to say that there's a necessary existing reality that caused all contingent reality, I would call that God on a theistic sense. But these are the two; those are two arguments I've presented so far. I've presented the like first cause argument and the contingency argument. Um, if you want to go after those, we can go a little deeper. If you don't think that that provides a rational foundation for theism.
Yeah, sure. Maybe we can focus on your claim that this prior cause has to be a conscious
Okay,
being.
okay. So the agency of the spaceless and timeless reality that caused.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's go after that. So, do you find it more plausible to say that there are necessary and sufficient conditions that are timelessly present but have not given rise to their effect, or maybe they're some embedded law of nature? I think you were saying that would explain why it wasn't.
Do
So,
I think that's more plausible?
yeah.
I don't think. I mean, I don't know. I start with I don't know.
So
You
they're
know, like
right now they're equally plausible. So what do you think is the what do you think would be a potential objection to the reasoning process I laid out?
well, that like in our experience, we observe non-conscious things giving rise to other things.
Oh, I yeah, for
You
sure.
know, so that's I mean that's my reason. It's very simple. You know, I can imagine a person, a conscious person, a being giving rise to something through active will. I can also imagine a non-personal process of some kind giving rise to the universe.
Yeah, so effects being produced obviously don't imply agency. It's obviously not the case. I think the formation of stars is pretty deterministic on the laws of physics, right? So, given time, gravity, and sufficient mass, it will collapse in nuclear fusion. You have star. I agree with that. Um, but what is true, and maybe this is where I might try to explain this better. This might be a failing on my part. That any impersonal, deterministic conditions that lead to an effect don't produce its effect until all the conditions are sufficient, right? So if you take the star example, you don't have a star until all those conditions are met, and that's the sort of mechanically nature operating systems that we have that would explain effects. But when
Is it
there's
the case? Is it the case with God that the universe doesn't come into existence unless all the conditions are met?
so I would agree that if we're taking God in the classic theistic sense, that God is an agent with free will, that the the sufficient condition to produce an effect would be eternally present and timelessly present in God's power to create the universe, like if he has that causal power to do so. And it wouldn't be sufficient in this timeless being until an act of will, a volition, is made
Hmm.
to say that if that's a sufficient condition, then the answer would be no. That it's not met until the volition is made. But you could say the potential to create it's there in I guess in the causal power. So this kind of
So the potential to create it is there.
right.
Is it the case with this sort of non-personal prior cause that we're kind of just imagining? Is it the case that the potential for the universe to come to exist is there?
So this is a question I've been wrestling with myself. I've been trying to think of a way to say, okay, if I'm going to hold to this argument as one of my rational basis, is there a way, a logically consistent way to explain an impersonal set of eternally and timelessly existing sufficient conditions? Um, there's no way to produce the new effect. Like, is there a way for it to suddenly be sufficient and not be sufficient and be timeless? Now, I couldn't think of one, and I've still been kind of churning over this in my own mind because, like, for if I found a way to explain it, I would abandon this argument. Not like theism as a whole, but I would say that this argument wouldn't really establish a good connection. Now, I haven't thought of one yet. Everything I throw at myself, I defeat it with. It just seems more rational to say that agency makes more sense. It'd be, I think, I think it was still Kant that gave the example of the man sitting in the chair. So think of a man sitting in a chair for timelessly eternal past. The man has free will though. He can just
I'm sorry.
suddenly.
I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you're
I
good.
just want to give the conversation like a 5 minute warning. Just want to give you a heads up so
Oh,
we can because I got to go in
oh, you're
like
good. You're
about
good.
5 minutes.
Okay, I'll throw this one. This is how I'm thinking of it. Um, the example of the man. So remember the ball and the cushion, right? So now say it's a man in a chair. A man sitting in a chair from eternity's past, timeless, no time. There's no change, it's static. But we're going to assume the man has free will in a sort of basic sense, if we're assuming that's a thing. At any point, he can free will to stand up, right? So the idea of free will is spontaneous new causation without any antecedent conditions. I can't think of a mechanically impersonal operating system that would be timeless and set like that. Just seems to be agency to me. Now that's not really an argument, but I'm open to an explanation that would necessitate that, if that makes sense. Like if there's some kind of impersonal, sufficient, timeless reality, it's sufficient to create the universe, and it's impersonal, so it doesn't just choose to do it at a later. Like you can't say choose because it's impersonal. Like why would the effect begin a finite time ago? Because you could have an eternal existing cause and effect, like the cushion of the ball.
Hmm.
So that's
So
oh
that's a good question. Why would it begin, a finite time ago rather than another time?
yeah,
Basically,
and
that's what you're
remember,
saying there.
yeah, and that's assuming all the things we've said up to this point, because you can take one of those out and it breaks down. I agree, and I think that's what some of the
Okay.
people commenting would do. But
So how about
if we're going those one steps at a time, we're saying okay, you got the principle of sufficient reason, you've got the beginning of the universe, space and time, and you got these properties, a timeless reality that caused the universe, is sufficient to do so. Is that reality personal or not? And like, it just seems like it's not so much that it's a matter of inductive evidence. It's just that, as far as I can think of, I can't think of an explanation on how it wouldn't be a person or wouldn't be an agent that chooses to start a finite time ago a temporal effect. It's
yeah,
so
I could. I mean, it's in its nature to do so.
well. So then there would be measurable time before that, and it wouldn't be timeless, right? Because it would be sufficient at that time. I guess you could say.
Can't you say that about a will though? Like a person, like
I
there
think
would have
you
been a finite time before they chose.
Well, so in the case of the way the theists conceive of God and creating the first moment of creation, is that God is timeless, sans the universe, sans time, and then since the moment of creation, yeah, God is temporal. So that would follow, I think, that as
Hmm.
soon as God makes a change, God is now in time. Um, but what for to get from timeless to temporal, and if it's impersonal and mechanically operating, those conditions would have to always be there. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be timeless. And then
Hmm.
you just have you wouldn't really have you'd just be pushing the beginning back a further step, and then you'd
Hmm.
get back to the same problem, right? So if
So, but
may,
with the case of God, was the will to create the universe always there? Is that a condition that was always there?
yeah, this question is really good because explaining the word always, that temporal phrase gets
Hmm.
difficult to explain in a timeless sense. So you could say like there's an eternal. I think some Christians say there's an eternal will to create the world, but you can't think of it in a timeline sense because the creation's the first moment, right? So there is no before the first moment. It's just timeless. So yeah, yes, God would have created that moment, and that's the first moment of time. That's when the will happen, and then God is just timeless, sans that creation. I'm not saying before because that's not technically correct. You can't say before time, but uh, no, I think you make a good point. So it would be true that God's in time at the point of creation. It's not that there's some decision process that led up to it because it would be timeless.
Hmm.
So like you can object saying okay a timeless person doesn't make sense or like I think that's directions you can go. But if we're given all these assumptions leading up to it and like all these givens up to it, maybe if you could like I'm trying to think of an example like the cushion ball or the man chair, or if you think of a non-person example of when you can have a spontaneous new effect out of timelessness that's impersonal, that's not an act of volition. Just as far as I can think, I can't really think of one that's not just trying to avoid the conclusion. Like I can try, but like if I'm just being honest with myself, I can't think of one. But I'm open to a sort of analogy and explanation that could do so.
So say that again. You said you can't think of what? You can't think of.
So I can't think of an explanation from timeless sufficient conditions to spontaneous new effect without antecedent conditions in time that isn't agency. That isn't an act of volition. Like I think that is what that would be. But I can't think of one that wouldn't be intentionally trying to avoid that conclusion of theism, right? Like I could try to explain out of it for the sake of getting out of it, but if I'm being honest with myself, it makes more sense to say that that's what a volition would be. It'd be a state of sufficient causal power to create something, causal conditions to create something, being timeless, so no change, an eternally timeless thing. And that's not an enduring infinite number of years. It's timeless. There's no time. And to go from that, static, nothing, to spontaneous new effect, a finite time ago, it just that makes the most sense to say that that's just cognitive agency, making a decision, like the man choosing to stand up from the chair that he's been sitting, like then time would start.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the best analogy. I know it's like a weird contrast, but I mean, we exist in time, so we're not ourselves acquainted with a timeless reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of amazing that we can even talk about this. Like our language is so sophisticated, but
Yeah, I mean, it's in its nature to be spontaneous. How about that as an
so
answer?
why? I think that could be true. What if that's what agency is? It's in the nature to make a decision based on its internal conditions. Maybe that's just what agency is. That's what consciousness is. You can almost say that
Mm-hmm.
about us when we make decisions. Now I know not, a lot of people don't believe in free will, especially like naturalists. Like if nature's all that exists, we're just the mechanical operations of our chemical nervous system. But we're not going to assume that either way, right? Like just for the sake of that argument, if we're assuming that's the case, when we make decisions and we're the volitions, we're the first cause of that decision process, or whatever our agency is, whether it's a soul or not. Um, I see that as being kind of the same thing, just explained in different words. But
Hmm. So you're saying when I say a
it,
non-theistic first cause could be something that was non-theistic, non-personal, non-conscious. It was mechanical, and it was in its nature, even though it was timeless, it was in its nature to spontaneously give rise to a universe. You're saying that is the same thing. Basically, I'm describing consciousness.
well, it's not that it's consciousness, right? Because that's like in its sort of psychological sense. But when you say that you can, for the sake of the argument, concede that there's a timeless, spaceless, sufficient condition to causal power reality that was timeless and spontaneously created a new effect, and just not call it consciousness. I mean, you can do that. That's what I'm calling it. Like it seems to be the modus operandi of what it means to make a decision, for it to be a spontaneous new effect in time without antecedent conditions.
So you're saying you're calling it consciousness, and I'm wondering why.
I
Like
well,
why?
I guess you could say I'm calling it a volition. I mean, I would say a volition implies consciousness, yes, but to say that's a volition would be a spontaneous event by whatever the entity is that creates it or whatever, that doesn't have antecedent determined conditions. It would be the first causal moment of that
Yeah,
process.
I get. See, for me, I fall back to my agnosticism, and I hear that, and I'm like, okay, that works as one potential explanation. Maybe it was a volition, a conscious choice on the part of a being. At the same time, maybe it wasn't. Like maybe it was in the nature of this non-personal reality to spontaneously give rise to the universe. Like I see both of those in my mind as being equally explanatory.
I'm actually okay with that. I mean, I could see that to some degree as well. And that's why I was clear to say I don't find it compelling, but I think it could provide a rational bait. Like you wouldn't say that's irrational to believe that necessarily. So if it's rational to believe, then that's kind of all I was defending. I find it slightly more persuasive. Like my scale tips a little bit because it would be me being more incredulous to just say like I don't know from my own perspective, because I can't really stay neutral on anything forever unless I'm apathetic. That's just me. So like I know, and I used to, when I was presented with cosmological arguments, I would be very incredulous on the conclusion because I was avoiding the conclusion. That's just me. I'm not attributing that motive to anyone else. I know those people exist because I was like that, and I've met people like that. Like they didn't want it to be God, so they'll be willing to be incredulous on data to do so. Now, I have an analogy. I got a friend like that was like this, and if you want, we can close with this. And I've been trying to think of a better analogy because this one sounds like I'm trying to compare it, and I'm not. But no, I'm not saying agnostics or atheists are equivalent in ignorance and irrationality, but it reminds me kind of the flat Earth people. I didn't believe that these people were real for a while. I thought they were all trolls, but they're very real, and it's really weird. But it's not the comparison I'm trying to make here is definitely not their degree of intelligence at all, but it's the incredulity I see. That their willingness to raise their skeptic meter so high to avoid certain outcomes. I was like that, and when I opened myself up to it, I was willing to accept that it's not compelling. But if I'm not being like that, if I'm not just trying to avoid the conclusion, it's a lot more rational to say, at least for me, it was a lot more rational to say that yes, I mean, this makes sense to say that this was a volition instead of just in a sort of inexplicable, spontaneous creation that should have been eternal, like the depression was. But I don't think it's irrational to not believe that at all, because it is a sort of leap to go from internal temporal experiences to that. Like it seems like a large leap, but I try to do my best to go one step at a time. But I think something that would help is if you can give an analogy like I did. I'm trying to think of one too, like the ball or the man, of an example of a timelessly existing conditions that are impersonal that suddenly start doing something, but they're timeless. Like if we can think of that
An analogy. How can you come up with like a real analogy, like an analogy?
well, I mean, it wouldn't be literally real because obviously there's no such thing as an eternally existing timeless
Yeah,
being.
that's what I'm trying to
But
understand.
but Kant didn't have one, right? He didn't have an example of like he had an example of an eternally existing agent that did something spontaneously, and an eternally existing non-agent that just is static and is just like that forever. But if we can have that middle one that we're looking for, if we can come up with something like that, I think that would help explain what you're conceiving a little better because I'm actually not seeing it. When you explain the conditions and then it's just in the nature to do so, that seems like when I'm thinking through, it's just another explanation, but not calling it a volition. That's what it seems like to me. But I'm trying to think, and I might come up with one if we talk again. Maybe I'll have one because I felt like I was close. But anytime I think of things starting to occur to make it cause like that, you just have time. It's not timeless. It would be wrong to say it's timeless. I think a better way out of this argument is to not explain away its conclusion as not being an agent. I think what's better is to actually deny some of the earlier premises, right? Like denying that there's a beginning. I think that's a much better way to do it, or to maybe deny the causal principle, like something like that.
Hmm.
'Cause that's what I did. Like if I'm going to abandon this argument, I would probably do so on the scientific data, kind of like you did, which is to say that we don't know enough information. The M theory is incomplete. It might be eternal, something like that. Because I think not only is that just more plausible, I think that's more likely. It's more probable to be the case if we're going to do that. But I would and we'll probably have to do it another time. I have a sort of philosophical argument for a beginning that's not based on the scientific data because scientific data is always tenable. But I think I've passed my 5 minute mark.
It's all good, man.
If you need me to let you go, do you have any questions for me? Like any closing ones?
Yeah, I'm gonna go, but no, man. No, I don't have any questions. It was interesting discussion because yeah, like even it was interesting because you said let's start with the assumption that this universe had a like beginning, like time had a beginning, matter had a beginning, everything. Like let's just accept that as true, and that of course there's other explanations that that may not be true. But if we just start
Yeah,
there,
yeah. You have to have your steps. Like I think that's a whole thing that should be argued for. You should argue the beginning of the universe if this is a part of your case for theism. Um, but I mean, you were willing to accept that to see where it went
hmm,
for sure.
yeah, that's why I think it was interesting,
But
right?
what
Because I hear cosmological arguments, and that's exactly like I think my main like issue with them are the idea that this is a conscious being.
Yeah, I think
So
that's where a lot of people take the issue. Like they're kind of willing to grant as plausible that there's a beginning because and the problem with arguing for it sometimes is it involves a lot of scientific data that I think an average person isn't really well acquainted with. Like I'm not even really well acquainted with. I just happen to read up on a lot of the journals that are published, but and so it just sounds like a bunch of jargon thrown out, and so it's not very good for an audience. But I think you do need to, if you get to that point, I think that is a contentious point that has to be like defended. Like if you're going to say the universe began, you can't just take it for granted. Like you need to have a case. Now I have one. We just didn't do that in this video, but I think what people take more issue with is what you said, is the idea that it's a conscious reality that produced this first beginning, because I mean that's theism, right?
Hmm.
So, and a lot of the time I find people, and I'm kind of repeating myself, I find people avoiding certain scientific conclusions out of incredulity,
Right.
but
Yeah.
not as much the other one. Like that's a lot more foreign a concept, right? Like that's harder to actually rationally accept if you're open minded. To say, I mean, a conscious, timeless reality sounds absurd. So I think people are less likely to object to that, which is why I think it was good for you to do it that way. That was very sincere to do it that way.
Cool, man. Thank you for hurting my brain.
Oh yeah,
Ah.
no, you're good at questioning things. Like that's why I like it. If we can pick up on it moving forward or talk about other things, because I've got a whole list of random crap I like being interviewed on. So you're good at questioning. That's what I like about it.
Cool. All right,
All
man. I
right,
appreciate it.
all right. Talk to you later.
Later.